Okay, Dennis. So this is your first call, and we've already been chatting for a while, but I'll go ahead and do a bit of recap about what we've been talking about.
Okay.
It's that for a beginner, Buddhism looks almost overwhelming because of its complexity. And yet, if we can find a thread that runs through that complexity, we'll begin to see the actual root or the center tap, or perhaps we can think of it as a tree, and that this is the heartwood, the strong wood that's on the inside of the tree, and yet on the outside of the tree, depending upon the variety, there's all kinds of things that are different. The fruit's different, the shape of the leaves are different, and all that kind of thing. But one of the things that they all have in common is this heartwood. And that this concept that I just gave you, this heartwood, actually, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa wrote a book called Heartwood of the Bo Tree. Let's get down to the real stuff about what's going on. And all of the Buddhisms have this, but that it's covered over oftentimes by culture and doesn't make it well into Western uh, thinking and mentality. Partly because it's turning everything upside down. The West, for instance, is very past oriented. Our history is important. It defines who we are, and blah, 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 blah. And our future is important, and where we're going, and all of that. And politics is important, and making a living is important, and getting money is important, and all of that kind of stuff. But within the teachings of the Buddha, really what's going on is that everybody is merely in a state of trying to avoid suffering, and they do it in a haphazard way, partly because the way that they're avoiding suffering is based upon how they were told this is the way that you become happy.
Okay.
And so
Yeah.
we buy all of that stuff from people who do not demonstrate happiness to us, and yet we take their word for it anyway,
Yes. Yes.
especially if they promise it way off into the future.
Mm.
Way off into the future. And there is some Buddhism that got stuck in that kind of thought pattern about way off into the future, like after you die, what's going to happen. In
Yes.
fact, nobody knows. Nobody's come back. Everybody that's been dead and come back to life has very little story to tell other than the dying process. The dead part, they don't know.
Yes. Yeah. Hmm.
All right. So basically, what we're looking at then is the real teaching of the Buddha is how do we avoid suffering? And an additional point is how do we avoid suffering while we're suffering? In other
Mm.
words, how do we come out of the suffering that we have now rather than making plans for how to get out of future suffering? An example of how to get out of future suffering is by starting a preemptive war.
Mm.
Oh, well, they're going to attack us. We better attack them first. Well, guess what? Every war is like that. Every attack,
Yeah.
almost every attack, is based upon fear that if we don't get them first, they'll get us.
Yeah.
All right. So the real issue is fear. Most of what we do in life is to avoid danger and avoid fear because we feel afraid. Now, here's something very interesting about that. Coming out of our deep past, life was tough. Life was tough on the savannas. Life was tough for the proto human being before the human being came. That they believe actually that uh, the knowledge of how to start and control fire was the secret point that made humans the human. And they don't know how far that goes back, but it looks like 600,000 years. And that there's been a number of subspecies that were very much like us that did have fire, for instance, the Neanderthals, but they died out.
Okay.
And perhaps they died out because of they were very robust and heavy and could track very, very large prey. But when the ice receded, they couldn't manage in northern Europe anymore because the kind of elephants or mastodons that they tracked were no longer available, and they hadn't developed the technology. But you better believe that if they're out there tracking mastodons, they had fire. So this whole quality of then fire means that now we can cook our food, and that an example of that would be tubers or roots like modern day potatoes, the ancient version of potato. To eat a potato raw requires a lot of effort, a
Yeah.
lot of work, and it's not very tasty, and it's hard to digest. But once we can be able to cook that potato, now we can get more value out of it. That more value, then, that extra energy that we're getting out of having a cooked food, then was what was capable of growing the frontal cortex. Before we grew the frontal cortex, we lived a very primitive lifestyle that goes back millions of years, right back to the alligator. That in fact, much of our brain looks like the brain of an alligator. They
Yeah.
even call it the reptilian brain. Well, this is actually, if you think about it like this, everything that an alligator can do, that you can do, you do it with your reptilian brain. And all of the things that an alligator can't do, you can do. You can do that because of the extra capacity mentally. But now breathing and walking and chewing food and seeing and hearing and wagging our tail, all of that is controlled by the reptilian brain. And it is a very, very primitive program. And so most people live their lives instinctually, which means that they live their lives in fear. They live their lives in a self-preservation instinct. They collect material goods around them in order to protect themselves. And they build fortresses for housing, etc., like that. And that it goes then against all of the society part of us, which would be sharing, generosity, feeding the poor, getting along, and all of that kind of stuff. So we've got this kind of duality, the higher mind and the lower mind. And whenever the lower mind is involved, it's pretty far away from the actual reality of our modern living. And that one of the ways that we can look at dukkha is the further away we mentally live from the actual world that we live in, the more there's going to be dukkha or dissatisfaction or suffering.
Okay.
And so I use the word dukkha, and it's almost always in English translated as suffering, but let's understand that there's various degrees of suffering. There's
Yes.
even various degrees of dukkha that we wouldn't even call suffering, but there's still dissatisfaction. That we leave, who was it? One of the philosophers said, oh, it was Henry David Thoreau who said, men lead lives of quiet desperation. All right. This is what the Buddha then is addressing, is this desperation that we have inside so that we can come to a state of satisfaction rather than being constantly dissatisfied. Now, this actually is not only the core of Buddhism, it's actually the core of all religion. And it basically, religion answers the question, what the hell? Or more nowadays, the younger people would say, what the fuck? Okay, that's the religion is the answer to confusion.
Yes. Yeah. That's
That
what.
we
Yeah.
try to make sense out of the world, and oftentimes men have been making sense out of the world wrongly and passed it down over and over and over again, to where
Yes.
very rarely is the practice of here's how to come out of your confusion and turn confusion and terror, because confusion has to do with fear. There is fear involved with that. That's part of the desperation. If we were desperate but not afraid of anything, we wouldn't be quite so desperate after all, now would we?
Yes.
Right. So it has a lot then to do, desperation has a lot to do again with being afraid. And so you I don't know whether you've heard this or not, but the Buddha was really big on fearlessness.
Yes, I have read.
All right. Here's why. Because becoming fearlessness means that we are able to manage now the most basic instincts, this
Mhm.
instinct of survival. Now, the frontal cortex, they can look and say, hey, man, there's no danger. Why are you afraid? And yet we still have this underlying fear that's coming out of basically the training that we had in childhood, plus this big bag of DNA that sets us up for being afraid. That very, very few, you know about natural selection, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Well, um, humans have naturally selected themselves to be overly sexed because the people who didn't care about sex much, they don't have very many kids. Okay, so those that are up to our left, we're oversexed beyond
Yes.
what we need. And not only that, but we're very fearful about it. Instead of just recognize, oh, that's just the genes. Yeah, there they go. We know we got to live in a human body. We'll get over it. Instead, we go around
Yes. Yes. Very.
very primitive, the way that because we've become desperation due to the lack of understanding. And so much of the teaching of the Buddha has to do then with let's look at what's going on. Not let's look at what's going on in the sense of what does this book of sutras or that Bible or everything like that from old timey stuff says, but rather the invitation is let's look at this enormous library called this human being. So that we've got to wade through there and find out all of the techniques and methods and style of operation that this human being does that causes him to be suffering rather than free from suffering. Also with enough about Buddhism to know that not only is the Buddha big on fearlessness, but also freedom. There is this
Yes.
word called moksha.
Hmm.
The what did I state? Watsuan Mok. There's that Mok. Okay. I had a teacher in India. His name was Muktananda.
Yes.
All right.
That's
So,
yeah. Muktananda. I know who that is. Yes. Yes. Muktananda.
right. So Muktananda means the happiness of freedom.
Hmm.
That's what the word Muktananda means. Uh, you can also translate it as the word bliss.
Mm.
Uh, you could also say it's bliss and freedom, but the easy way to just say that the happiness is freedom, freedom from being unhappy.
Yes.
So this whole quality of mukta or freedom has to do then with the way that we practice each moment. That rather than going off and sitting down in meditation and practicing for 4 years, in order then something magic's going to happen and all of a sudden you feel free. But whether if you go and practice the feelings of being free, then by practicing that, you'll get some value out of it.
Mm.
Freedom, because you're actually practicing being free. So basically what we're really getting at then, the heartwood of the Bodhi tree of the Buddha is around the concept of let's do the right thing right now. That's almost the whole teaching in a nutshell. But the Buddha put it in a further deeper nutshell, and that was dukkha, dukkha nirodha. Also, you've got in my emails, you can see, don't worry, be happy. That's the actual method of stating the entire teaching of the Buddha.
Okay.
Don't worry, be happy.
As I wish. I mean, it's easier said than done.
Ah, why?
Well, I mean, sometimes. I mean, the stress, the limitations that are put on you. You know, like you said, the living. Uh, they expect you to get this much stuff and get this, have this family, and go to this school and get this type of, all these different things.
Because, in fact, when we say it like that, don't worry, be happy is right here immediately, right now.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the person will do that with the plan that, okay, later I'll be unhappy and I'll worry.
Yeah, yeah.
At least right now I can be happy. All right. Well, that has a lot of value because when that time comes in the future when it's okay to be unhappy, maybe he can make that same choice. Wait a minute, I'll postpone it again and I'll stop worrying now and be happy right now instead.
Yes.
And so he postpones it again. And then the worry comes up again. And he says, I think it's time that I feel worry. And he says, wait a minute, I've already gotten some experience now that I don't have to worry right now. I can be happy instead. Let me postpone it again.
Mm.
That whole point that I'm making here is basically the way of correct practice. That we use the word meditation, but the word meditation is not the right word to use. I will go so far as to say that much of the vocabulary of Western Buddhism in English is actually Catholic words.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense actually.
Right, especially since the guys who wrote translated the sutras the first and gave us our first vocabulary were Christians.
What? Really? That's
Yeah.
crazy. I never knew that.
Uh, the history is of the
What?
history of the Polytext Society in London, and the original scholars who were doing that was I.B. Honer and Riles Davies, and then after he died, his wife. And those
Wow.
three people had a lifelong thing, and then later, uh, Christmas Humphreys and a whole bunch of people. I mean, it became a society in London.
Okay, yeah, because I was gonna say like uh I've had always a problem like because like I love Buddhism, but like sometimes you read something and it's like it sounds like legalistic, like really um kind of like I know a little bit about Christianity, so maybe like the penal substitution type of way of thinking, where it's like penances and like you have to work for something because there's a problem with you or something like that. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, what that means is that in order to get into English language, Buddhism was westernized just a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
All right, which means that westernization is now going to be, if you look at the associative law of multiplication, where Zen would be a B and Theravada would be a C and Tibetan would be a D, then perhaps Western Buddhism is now an E.
Mm.
And yet at the same time, the A is constant throughout there, and that we can still pull the A out of it, recognizing that it is going to be a bit tough to detangle the teachings of the Buddha from Western Buddhism, but it's also a bit difficult to detangle the teachings of the Buddha from Theravada. it's actually easier for someone who studies both Theravada and Tibetan Buddhism in the United States, grown up and compares these two. It will be easier for him then to see the thread of A going through B and C, and he can see the distinctions between B and C better than the locals. Those who were raised in a Theravada country, it's very hard for them to pull Theravada out of the teachings of Buddha.
Yeah, that would make sense. Just like
All right. So it's
Christians.
also very difficult then for the Westerners to pull Western concepts and ideas out of the teachings of the Buddha that's called Western Buddhism.
Hmm. Yeah.
All right. So let us then make this distinction, and the distinction would be that what we're going to call this new stuff is supramundane Dhamma, because that was a word that the Buddha used. That he took everybody, by the way, who comes into a new organization, even in the time of the Buddha, all of those people who came to the Buddha came with all of their old baggage and all their old beliefs.
Hmm. Yeah, like the Vedas and everything like that.
Right. And so he had to understand where they were coming from in order to be able to teach them how to come out of that into a better way of thinking.
Mm.
And so Buddha's association with not modern Hinduism, but the Brahmanism of the day is laced throughout the suttas, and that many people will say, oh, well, they're both in there. Therefore, it's up to you, to where that's actually not correct. Yes, they're both in there, but if you're really a Pali scholar and understand what's going on, the Buddha is actually, um, it depends upon his audience. That's one of the clues. If he's talking to brand new people that have never seen him before and they're asking him questions, his only intention is to get them to feel comfortable with him, to begin to trust him. But once he's got students who have been around for a long time and then are still clinging to the beliefs that those original Brahmins had, he's going to thump them pretty hard, because we got some sutras doing that, where he's thumping them pretty hard. Oh, no, I did not teach that.
Yeah.
That's not what I teach. You're believing something else. And so in that regard, we have to understand then that these two levels of Buddhism, the cultural Buddhism and the actual teachings of the Buddha, reside in every country.
Mm.
In every different tradition, we actually have these nobles. In the time of the Buddha, everyone who came to the dispensation of the Buddha made it into the noble or into the supramundane ranks. But there's something that happened about 275 BC, after 300 BC for sure, and that was during the time of Ashoka, that his great-great-great-grandfather actually knew the Buddha. His great-great-grandfather actually supported the first council. So he probably was a warrior and didn't have much to do with it, but when he first saw monks that had been jailed, it wasn't like they were completely strange, because it was part of his family's tradition. But when he started listening to the monks, he understood exactly what they were saying, and unfortunately, then Buddhism became the state religion.
Mm.
Buddhism becoming the state religion was a very unwholesome thing to happen, because by becoming the state religion, many people from all different varieties and schools and whatnot would come and join to become monks without having proper education, that they overwhelmed the teaching staff. It was like having a small university, let us say, that had 10,000 students and 200 faculty. And now, within 2 years, that school grows to 200,000 students, and they still have 200 faculty.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, you can see the problems associated with
Yeah,
that. Well,
that would.
that's what happened to Buddhism. And so it became polluted then with the teachings that the Buddha actually used in the beginning to teach out of. Those teachers who really understand this, they still teach that way. So that a noble will actually talk ordinary language to ordinary people because he knows that they're not ready for the noble.
Okay.
And so when he's around nobles or when he's around students who really want to know, he's going to give them the noble teaching. This has been true throughout all of the history. And it was especially true within Thailand, and that I have some history with that I'll share with you. But it actually has to do with that the noble Buddha knowledge was closely related to the royal family of Thailand and still is, to where many of the people throughout Thailand, they still are doing a lot of magical thinking. The magical thinking that they had is of two sources. One, surprisingly enough, Thailand, ancient Thailand, had its own religion. But that religion, which has a lot of superficial stuff left with it and some belief systems to it, actually fit fairly well with Hinduism from India because of the age. We're talking about way, way back when.
Yeah.
And so the idea of spirit houses or the biggest tree on the highest hill being sacred, that's Thai. But you can see how the whole concept of a big tree on the top of a hill being sacred comes actually from, well, where does sacredness come from? That's widespread throughout all of humanity. The whole idea that there are some things that are really special. And in fact, everybody suffers.
Yes.
Even that big tree on the top of the hill has its own.
Yeah.
All right. So that's in that regard, the teaching of the Buddha is quite universal. So now let's start looking at this idea that there are two layers of Buddhism. One layer of Buddhism has a lot of really good stuff in it. Let us say that the only option would be absolute chaos. This could be called wrong view. Absolute chaos. Anybody can do anything that they want to do. But when they have the idea that, oh no, you will have to pay for your purchases.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The whole idea then of karma, that was the Hindu idea, is that there are good deeds that give good results, and there are bad deeds that give bad results. And that's true. We can see that. We'll talk a lot about it. But then they make a permanent kind of thing to it. They actually make it religion by adding a bit of magic to it. And that bit of magic is, and that good action will eventually, no matter what, give you good results, and that bad action that you had will eventually, no matter what, will give you bad results.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's the magic. And in fact, every young teenage boy knows that if he plans it right, he can get away with it.
Yeah.
So every kid knows that that's not true, and yet many religions are based upon it.
Okay.
But we do know that there is good action that gives good results, and there is bad action that gives bad results. But there's a whole lot of action that we're not quite sure about.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one of the ways of looking at this is that karma, or action, has another kind, at least one other kind, and that is that sometimes we don't know. It's confused or is actually mixed. And there's something else to learn about that action, and that is often the goodness or badness of the action is based upon the outcome. So it's the result, and the goodness or badness of the result determines the goodness or the badness of the action. Here's an example of that. You buy some stock in the stock market. If the stock goes up, it was a good purchase. If the stock goes down, it was a bad purchase, right?
Yes.
Case solved. That's just such an easy point to see, but then you recognize that we take actions with the intention of having good results, and things just fell apart.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very,
All
very
right.
much.
Okay. Here's another one, and that is on the sport field. The penalty flag goes up, and half the crowd stands up and cheers and is very happy and satisfied with that penalty flag's call. And the other half of the stands up with their arms raised in the air, angry because they don't like the call. Now, was that call a good penalty flag call or not?
Well, it's relative according to the team.
Precisely, and we can't even bring out whether it was correct or not,
Yeah. Hmm.
because whether it was a correct call or not doesn't change those massive people's opinions of it.
Yeah.
So, in that regard, now we have to understand that karma is a whole lot more complicated than they try to make it out at the church.
Yes. Yeah.
And by the way, this whole idea of karma has to do with, in Christianity, they use the word sin,
Hmm.
but they only mean when they talk about sin is bad actions.
Yes.
Okay. So it's just a change in vocabulary. So we were originally then talking about how this thread of Buddhism is actually kind of there in all the religions. Sometimes it's really hard to find that thread. But an example of that would be what Jesus taught is a whole lot closer to what the Buddha taught than the way that Christianity has evolved.
Yes. I mean, yeah, I know a lot about the history of like the doctrines of Christianity and how weird they got, due to the culture of its time and things like that.
Mm-hmm. But all of it is based upon the fact that they could not become fearless. And one of the things, though, that Jesus didn't talk about much, but he actually was able to demonstrate, was that he was fearless.
Hmm.
He wasn't afraid of Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, I mean, as we all see. Yeah.
That, in fact, they say that the Garden of Gethsemane is located in such a place that it would have been easy for him to escape the Roman troops.
Hmm.
And yet he stayed in the Garden of Gethsemane all night waiting for them to come get him. Now, that's fearlessness.
It is, yes.
Okay, so Jesus had some qualities that are very close to the qualities of Buddha. But now you have Donald Trump, for instance, putting children in cages at the. Now, where is the fearlessness in that? And so you can see where Christianity has gone. It has, in fact, not worked in the sense that even though people are dedicating themselves to Jesus because they're not behaving like or practicing the way that Jesus would request that they practice, that they're
Yeah.
still living their same old ordinary lives.
Hmm.
All right. What this basically means then is that even though we give a culture some good rules, at best they can come up with an ordinary kind of right view that always winds up in suffering. So you either have a wrong view where everything winds up in chaos and destruction and war, or you wind up with all of the problems of piety and religious zealotism and all of that kind of stuff, because people are still living in the future, planning on the future, and wanting something out of the future, and they're not dealing with their present fear.
Which is the karma, which is like I'll work for blessings later, and things like that. Okay.
All right. Now, in the time of the Buddha, before the Buddha, there was also a lot of these various groups that had various spiritual practices, but that those spiritual practices didn't get started in India. They got started in every culture.
Okay.
Even
Yes.
very primitive tribes have their own religions and artistry and practices. And one of the things that modern day we don't quite understand, but in the old days, there was not a lot of stuff happening moment by moment. An example of that would be that here the dogs stay at this house and they sleep a lot, except when they're not sleeping. You can tell whether they're sleeping or not depending upon the ear. If the ear is up, that means he's listening. He's here now. And yet he may not even move when you come up because he knows who you are. But if a car comes up in the yard, out he goes. So this quality that the dog has, there's an old Zen koan about it, by the way. Perhaps you've heard. Does a dog have Buddha nature?
Yes.
And the answer is mu,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yes.
means both. Okay. Now, where does that of the line? Well, one of the qualities that makes a dog like a Buddha is because he's constantly in the here now. There's no place for him to go. His memories are not good. It's really hard to teach a dog tricks. Humans, we teach each other to play tricks a lot,
Yeah.
and we're very tricky because
Yes.
we have that kind of brain to do it, but it always has to do with planning and setup and bait and switch and all kinds of stuff so that we can take advantage of one another. Where the dog doesn't have that kind of mind. He stays in the here now a lot.
Mm.
But he doesn't have something that humans do have that we're capable of doing, and that is the capability of noticing, seeing directly, and understanding. In other words, the dog has only come up to a certain point. He's probably better off than humans, but that humans have the ability to, in fact, see the things the way that they really are and then start living the way that we would according to the way things really are, which basically has to do with then if the humans really understood the Buddha nature of a dog, they'd start living the way that dogs live, just hanging out and begging for food.
Hanging out begging for food.
And being satisfied with the way things are. So this is what we're really looking for is even though the human being his whole life has been trained to be dissatisfied, to be tricky, to be a liar, to try to gain advantage, to be unhappy, and all of this is based upon a subliminal set of fears that we have, even though that's our premise, when we remember to come out of that and to get out of that primitive state, that reptilian brain, we can, in fact, in a present moment, be very content, very happy.
Mm-hmm.
And then it doesn't last very long.
Yes.
But if we remember again, we can come back and be happy again.
Yeah. And mindfulness, right?
Mhm. Now, in the time of the Buddha, as I was about to say before, I got lost on dogs. The people had a lot of time on their hands and they had time to do spiritual practices. And so, one of the things that was developed was how strongly concentrated the mind can get. And the Buddha practiced this And he also practiced how much suffering or how much physical pain and endurance he could put up with in the sense of austerity. So he was really a master at all of the tricks of the trade of the time of the Buddha. And yet he recognized one thing for sure, and that is that he still is dissatisfied.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So what he began to put together was, wait a minute, there was a time when I was about 12 or something, it doesn't say, a young man, sitting under the rose apple tree, that he was experiencing what is called the first jhana. And the first jhana has actually satisfaction, it has contentment, it has pleasure, and it has a focus of mind associated with it. And then he said, wait a minute, why am I afraid of this pleasure of the first jhana? Now remember, he had just been all doing austerities where any kind of pleasure is a great big no-no to that folk. They want 100% punishment and starvation and meat hooks and self-flagellation and going bare naked and all kinds of stuff. And so he was saying, wait a minute, the contentment of one's mind is not the same as the sensual pleasures. And not only that, but mostly what people were doing with jhanas, the higher jhanas, was actually just looking for sensual pleasure. They just wanted to feel good. But they weren't stuff, when they would come out of such states, they went right back to the way that they were before. So this is where the Buddha came up with the idea then of using this first jhana and the tools that needed to get into first jhana to, rather than go for deeper states, the idea is to stay in this state more frequently.
Okay.
Now, one of the ways of looking at that then would be, we use the word concentration, and that immediately people think of in the Western when they hear the word concentration and associated with meditation, they think of concentration like orange juice, in the sense of frozen concentrated orange juice. We take the water out, right? Take out all the unessential ingredients and leave just the basic core. Yet the Christians translated the word samadhi then into this word concentration because they didn't really understand what they were originally getting at, to where the word samadhi actually means gathering together the factors that are needed. It's sort of like if you're going to make a cake, then you have various ingredients that are needed to be put together. And then one of the ingredients in is going to be the fire that's going to bake the cake. But sugar and milk and eggs and flour and all of that kind of stuff. Also, and if you're going to do an orange cake, you can drop a cubit of fresh concentrated orange juice in there and make orange cake. So what we're talking about here then, in order to get a cake, we've got to put all the ingredients together. And that's basically what is the word samadhi means. And that one of the ways that we use it is called, in this sense, is unification of mind. When one's mind is completely unified, that is the right noble concentration. Or actually, we're not using the word concentration now, we're using samadhi instead. And so right noble samadhi, or sama area samadhi, is then when the mind is concentrated. And when I'm saying concentrated, I'm using the wrong word again. Let us say unified. It's come together. Now, here's an example of when the mind is not unified. It's when someone is confused. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Another time the mind is not um, unified is when we're jealous. He's got it and I don't. Or when we're prideful. I'm better than he is. Okay, no unification there. How about when we lie? Well, that's certainly not unification of mind. And so basically, what one of the major differences then between ordinary religion and ordinary Buddhism that we'll call the Buddhist religion and the actual noble teachings of the Buddha is the following: that one's morality is dependent upon one's mind. Morality has a very small effect upon the mind, but the mind has total control over the morality.
That
In other
is
words,
so
a
true,
lot
yeah.
of, if your mind is unified, if your mind is noble, if you in fact don't want anything, if you're completely satisfied in the moment, then you're unlikely to go out shoplifting.
Yeah, and it's weird because you tend to think the other way around, which is if you're moral, then your mind will be okay. You know, like if you, which is asceticism, which is like if you restrain enough, then you'll, you know, eventually your mind will just be okay if you just hold back enough.
That's the training that you find in Christianity, and that's the training you find in ordinary Buddhism. And yet, would you think that it was possible that you would have a goody two shoes, someone who was always behaving correctly, looking for every opportunity to make sure that he or she was operating and acting correctly, and still they're full of fear, they're full of resentment, they're full of wanting things they don't have, but
Yeah.
they don't get them because they have this overly refined version of what is the right way to behave. And so their behavior actually contributes to their misery.
Yeah. Yes.
Is that
Very
possible?
relatable. Very relatable. At least in my end, because I've been raised in like a whole Christian background. You know, not all bad, of course. Just you know, the context I was raised in. Um, and then later in my life, as I got older, when I was 18, I was a Christian for like a very dedicated Christian for like 2 years, and I got into it, and then I encountered mysticism, you know, the Christian mystics, and um, but then eventually I left because I had my when I read the mystics, I was kind of confused, where I was like, wait, this is exactly like Buddhism and Hinduism, and it was kind of like just with different language, and then you know. It was an interesting revealing, but I like the way you explained that because it kind of takes away the burden of perfection, which is yeah, if that's a good way to word it.
Right. Okay. So, following along then with that, when we have a chaotic wrong view, anything goes, or another way of saying it, I can get away with it. If
Yeah.
we have the mentality, I can get away with it, there's no limit to the amount of harm and damage I can do to myself or to others.
Yeah.
All right. And this is the reason why people lie, is because they think they can get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
For Donald Trump, I'm not sure. I mean, he knows he's not getting away with it. Yet there he goes.
I know.
Ultimately, I guess he thinks he gets away with it. Even though they know I'm lying, it's still okay. And I,
Well, in my experience, if you lie so much, you just feel paranoid because like you're just like, oh my gosh, when is the moment you're gonna actually get caught?
but that's also being reported from people close to the White House that he's actually terror stricken.
Yeah. Oh man.
And he moves back and forth between elation and terrorism in his own mind. Um, not a happy place to be.
Mm-mm. No, no.
And so
Mm-mm.
um, there is then this right noble view And the right noble view is an overall way of seeing things. Rather than seeing selfish little me, we begin to see things from an overall or global thing. We look at things from the perspective of the cycles over time. That we can see that an example of that is that every 50 or 60 years or something like that, racism gets really, really vicious in the United States. 1830s, 1860s. No, wait a minute. It was before that in the 1800s. But anyway, 1860s, and then the 1920s, and then the 1960s, and here it comes again.
Like a loop.
Right, it's like a loop, and it depends upon a couple of generations, and then the grandkids get tired of it again. So beginning to see things in global cycles, understanding the way that we fit in, and understanding mostly that everyone's suffering.
Yeah.
Everybody's hurting. And that you actually now are beginning to understand with this right view that a lot of what right view has to do with is to look, to investigate, to see clearly, to become knowledgeable through witnessing. Now, this kind of witnessing that I'm talking about is there's two kinds of witness, and we'll talk about this later when it comes to actual how to practice. But there, you have the witness that saw the scene of the accident or the scene of the crime or whatever. And then maybe that same guy later is a witness on the witness stand telling a story. You can see there's a major difference between actually seeing what happens and telling stories about what happens. And so what our practice is going to be more and more about is coming to that point of the witness who witnessed things, who's looking at what's going on, rather than trying to tell ourselves stories about our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And this is what we call experience, as opposed to conceptualization or storytelling, that we actually are out there experiencing. And so much of what I have to teach is to teach the students how to do the experience themselves, but I can't teach it directly. I can't sit here and go, ooh, like that, and then teach you how to do that.
Yeah.
Then, in fact, if I did that too much, I think you wouldn't like it. But the whole idea about the experience then is that the only way that I can convey it is through concepts.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if I throw enough concepts at you, you can decipher them and pull out and get the experience that we're talking about, which is now got kind of a name to it, which is the experience of don't worry, be happy. The experience of being satisfied. That actually needs to be practiced.
Yes.
And so this is where the Eightfold Noble Path comes in, is to gain to this state of unification of mind, which then leads to excellent behavior. There are other aspects to the path that we have to get started on. And I've already started with the first one, which is right noble view. This next one is sati, as in anapanasati or the satipatthana. The word sati is generally translated as mindfulness.
Yes.
But generally, the word mindfulness loses some of the power of sati that I want to reinvigorate it with for you, is to give you really what we're talking about with sati is the ability of the very way to get started with it is thinking about to remember. And your job is to remember. And when do you remember? You remember when you need to remember. That the world, in fact, is full of good advice. Doctors, lawyers, preachers, teachers, uncles, they all have some good advice from time to time. Even accountants have good advice.
Yes.
The problem is when we get into a situation where we need that advice the most, we forget. And then we don't take the good advice. But instead, we do it the way that we've always done it.
Yeah, which is
A
fun.
really Right. A really clear example of that is that everybody would see automatically, and have probably heard this many times in your life, is when you get angry, the best thing to do is to keep your mouth shut.
Hmm.
And yet that is so hard to do. Everybody knows that, hey, we need to get out of this. And here we go, jumping right into it
Yeah.
because the energy is there. So then part of the training that we're talking about here of doing anapanasati is to learn how to control these impulses or these instincts. But we're only going to learn to manage and control them. We can't eradicate them because they're keeping you alive, for one thing.
Hmm.
And if you completely overwhelm them and overpower them, then they don't have a voice. You want these instincts to continue to have a voice, but they don't. But you don't want them to continue to run your life. And so the main way that we're going to begin to work with this is through this concept of sati, is to remember to look at what's going on right now. Now, this is also an aspect of anapanasati, is begin to experience the mind, means to look at what you're doing. Notice what's going on. In order to do that, we've got to wake up. How do I feel? What am I thinking? These are the kinds of questions that you would have through right view of investigation. How do I feel right now? What am I experiencing right now? What kind of thoughts do I have? Are these thoughts wholesome or not wholesome? So we begin to investigate. Now we bring in the next item, which is right effort. And right effort is going to take a little bit of time to talk about because almost everyone practices wrongly because of wrong effort. Some people want too much out of their meditation and they strain and they grunt and they do all kinds of things to try to get something and they don't even know what they're getting. And so they wind up without it and even more frustrated. Other people will practice meditation with the idea of choiceless awareness, and then they can la, 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 la right through all of the misery that their brain is doing, and they're not really paying attention to it because, after all, it's okay. The
Yeah.
example of that would be here you are standing in the middle of the road. Here you are. That's part of the story. And you look and notice down the road, and here comes a big truck. And all you have to do is just stand out of the way of the truck because you saw it coming. Now, if you stand in the road and see the truck coming and then you let it hit you, now you've got two problems. If you didn't see it coming and it just hit you, then you can blame the truck. But if you saw the truck coming and didn't get out of its way,
Oh, there we go.
all right, so this is the problem with choiceless awareness. Yeah, I can see what my mind is doing, but I'm not making that small change of merely stepping out of the way.
Yeah.
And so this is one's right effort, is to stand out of the way. Sati's job is to look up and down the road.
Hmm.
Well, actually, Sati's job is to remember to look up and down the road, and then one's right view is to look up and down the road. And then when we see the truck coming, then we stand out of the way. That's one's right effort.
Okay.
Okay. And then one's right attitude is in development. Next time you call, we'll talk a whole lot more about right attitude. But right attitude, when it's fully developed, is the attitude of a Buddha, the attitude of a lion, the attitude of a winner. And so we are going to then start to practice having the attitude that I can do this. To see when the mind wanders away and the student remembers that the mind wanders away, the first thing he will say is, oh, this is difficult. This is hard.
Yeah. 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 Or
This
get
this is hard.
discouraged.
I'm trying, but this is really hard. Okay, that's the wrong attitude, but it's still the same attitude that he's always had. The
Hmm.
right attitude is, hey, I caught you. hey, I can do this.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm successful. That's the way that we begin to use the Eightfold Noble Path then to practice anapanasati. And anapanasati is breathing mostly in the beginning. Because you see, one of the things about the reptilian brain and being on automatic pilot or being in a state of survival, which is where most people spend their time, is a shutdown mode. And we shut down the breathing. And yet, this frontal cortex that requires so much energy in the form of food also requires energy in the form of oxygen. And so, by doing deep breathing, this is why anapanasati and pranayama and all of these breathing exercises that are so wrapped up in music, dance, sports, warfare, all of these things, that if you can't get your breathing going, you're not going to be very successful at whatever your endeavor is. And that's also true about mind training. That we got to get the mind trained, and we need to train it with getting it the food and the exercise that it needs. So the exercise is sati. The exercise is right effort. And the outcome is right attitude. And the attitude is the attitude of a lion, the attitude of a winner, the attitude of one who can do and can come out of your suffering. And you can't, and this is nice. That's the way that we look at it. Oh, this is so nice. It is really nice to be out of worry and into being happy. So this is the way that we begin to practice. We use sati then to kick in right effort. And the right effort then is to start to take deep breaths, to breathe deeply, and to begin to recognize that you can change this. Now, one of the analogies I use, I got this one from a student, is he says that every human being is an emperor of their own pile of dirt.
That is so true.
And so the question is, are you half buried under your pile of dirt, struggling to get out? Are you completely buried by it? Or are you sitting on top of your own world? Are you really the emperor? Or are you subject to all of your subjects? This is basically, that little analogy is really excellent. We can look at it in the sense of clinging, and then not clinging is by letting go, we raise above all of the things that we were clinging to. Another way of looking at it is sitting on top of your own pile of dirt, you are the emperor. But if you are being controlled by your own pile of dirt, then you're not the emperor, you're just pile of dirt. And there's a me somewhere in that pile of dirt. So this is the way that we begin to understand the practice is to come out of whatever feelings that we were in with one's right effort, take a deep breath, and figure out that this moment is okay. This is an all right moment. There's nothing wrong with it. Everything that's wrong with it was what I was thinking about before, which is generally either in the past or the future. But right now, it's bloody nice. And so we begin to practice that way, is let's just enjoy the moment. Because that's all we really need to do. There is no goal to reach someday, because we just reached the goal. The goal is to just be happy, just to sit and enjoy the moment. That's all there is to it. And so that's what's to be practiced.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, like, the whole thing about effort is always like, here I go, I'm gonna do it this time, I'm gonna make it. Like, it's a loop, like, at least in my experience, where it's like you want to stop a bad habit or something, or you want to just stop. Well, it's like in the stopping you're still fighting, you're like you're still trying to like make something out of the situation more than it is, and then you keep trying again and again, and it's like a cycle. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. And so the kind of language then the Buddha uses with this is that the job has been done.
Mm.
What needed to be done has now been done. What did we need to do? We needed for this moment to clean out the mind. Now that we've cleaned the mind out, aha, I saw you. Let's say that we just had an argument with Aunt Susie. And now here I am sitting in meditation, or I think that's what I'm doing. But I'm actually now just mulling over about what I'm going to tell Aunt Susie next time I see her. But then Sati comes in, and we say, wait a minute. I don't need Aunt Susie right now. She's not here. And I may not be able to figure out what I need to say to her anyway that's going to get her to believe what I want her to believe and act the way that I want her to act. She's going to act the way she wants to act no matter what I tell her. And so let's not try to fix Aunt Susie. Let's try to fix this brain right now that's full of Aunt Susie.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that we see, oh, I'm thinking about Aunt Susie, and right view shows that, hey, wait a minute, this is not the right time to be busting the chops of Aunt Susie. And so here we go with right view and right sati. We've woken up to it. So now, aha, I see you, Miss Thoughts of Aunt Susie, and I don't need you. By having that new kind of thought, we've actually thrown Aunt Susie out. She may come right back in, but at least for this thought, she's out of here.
Yeah.
And so now I can start thinking about breathing. Well, I'm glad I don't have to think about Aunt Susie right now.
Yeah.
And so we chill out.
Okay.
And so this is the way that we begin to practice, to come back and to be here now with this breath. We can't have a thought about last year's breath or next month's breath. It's this breath, this one right now. Oh, but there was a time when I did have a good breath. I remember it well. No, nobody remembers a particular breath. But what we can remember is right now I can take a deep breath. I can take a good breath. I can feel good in this moment. And that's what we're beginning to practice, is this satisfaction, this state of, the word in Pali is sukha. And sukha is generally referred to as being opposite of dukkha. So if you're in a state of sukha, you're in a state of mental pleasure, then that's exactly opposite of being in dukkha. So now we're looking at the distinction between the first and the third noble truth. And the practice then is to get into and recognize that you're in the third noble truth. Right now, there's not a care in the world. Right now, everything is just great. That's your third noble truth. Right now is nibbana. Everything is cool. Not agitated or hot about anything. Just be easy. All right. And so this whole point then about practice is most people, when they're practicing meditation, they're practicing the way that they practiced everything. But this has got to be something different. And here's an example of that. If you wanted to learn to play the piano, if you had intention for the piano, you'd gotten a piano, you got piano books, you got a piano teacher, and yet you spend all of your time with a violin, is that going to help you learn how to play the piano? How about instead of a violin, if you spend all of your time with a math book? How about if you spend all of your time arguing with Aunt Susie?
Nope.
No, if you're going to learn to play the piano and that's your intention, we have to practice playing the piano. Now, this is almost obvious, and yet is for meditation.
There we go.
Rather practicing feeling good right now. We practice meditation so that we can feel good later.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't happen later.
No.
Whenever it happens right in the present moment, in the here now. And if we practice doing it in this here now, and we lay practice session after practice session after practice session into practicing that which we want to be, then it will come quickly. But if we stay there and wish for it and hope it comes while I'm doing something else, it's not going to happen. So we've actually got to practice playing the piano, or in your case here now, you got to practice being satisfied, got to practice being content. And by practicing that over and over again, you can begin to recognize, hey, I can do this. Hey, I can do
Yeah.
this. I can continue to practice, and I can get pretty good at it. And so
Yeah.
this is the way that this is actually why it's called practice. Anyway, practice is exactly the right word for it. That in Pali we use the word bhavana, which is often translated as development. But in the Anapanasati Sutta, it actually talks about each one of these things is a skill to be developed. The skill of sukha. Actually, step 10 of Anapanasati, and don't get confused about progression steps, that this is much more like a tango or a waltz than it is a hook, 2, 3, 4 kind of movement. So the steps don't come in order. But aspect number 10 is the aspect of gladdening the mind. And one needs to train gladdening the mind, because gladdening the mind, in fact, will then lead to the feeling of satisfaction. So he would say in that regard, I caught you, rather than, oh no, there the mind goes wandering away again, darn mind, it's a monkey mind. No, that's not gladdening the mind. Gladdening the mind is, I see you. Now you're going to need that technique when you begin to really see some of the deep crap that you really don't like. There is a saying, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Who said that?
Christ.
JC, right?
No.
Okay. But he left out the third line.
Oh,
Ye
man.
shall know the truth shall set you free, but first it'll piss you off. Why is that? Because it takes us out of our delusion, and we are attached to our delusional thinking.
Mhm.
And so when students begin to see that the mind keeps wandering away like that, they don't like it very much. And that's not the practice. The practice is, whenever you see the mind wandering away, you gladden the mind. You gladden
Yeah.
the mind. Pick it up. Whenever you fall down on the ground, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you boogie on down the road. But when we're sitting in meditation and the mind wanders away, oh, poor me. Okay. And this is exactly the right opportunity and the time to come out of that victimhood and become the lion. The I can do this. I can see this. I can do this practice. This is one of the most important skills to start to develop. The skill of being the emperor of your own pile of dirt, rather than just being a pile of dirt. And you can see the word victim and winner built into this. That the victim is where we spend our whole lives. We spend our whole lives in victimhood because we were trained to do it that way. We started off, we were born as a victim. We couldn't change our own diaper or feed ourselves, and so we start off as victims. Everybody's bigger than us, or the furniture is too big for us. We don't fit in. And so the child automatically begins to feel like the outsider. And that he cries because he doesn't get his way and he doesn't know how to get it. And so we start off with each child in The only skills that the child has are the developmental skills of the instinct. All of the rest of it is given to us as information by adults, but all of the adults around us are still operating on instinct. And so we raise our children and they wind up being adults living instinctual lives rather than living the lives of an actual human being. And by instinct, I mean they're afraid, they're jealous, they compete, they're prideful, they're angry, they want things they can't have, and generally they just make themselves miserable.
Mm-hmm.
And so the right way to do it is to say, in that moment, when we recognize that the mind is in a state of misery, is to say, hot diggity dog, I just caught you in a state of misery. Out you go.
Yeah.
And I'm going to clean that up. I'm going to feel good about the moment.
Yeah. Like, that's weird because usually you're taught, or at least the way you think of it, like, there's like, it's funny because, like, now that I think about it, it's almost like your mind just by default just says, oh no, well, looks like we failed, now try it again. And in that attitude, it's like you can only go so far and burn out, like that's where yeah, it's funny because the way you're saying it is so simple. It's like, oh yeah, oh, but in my mind it's like, oh yeah, it's like, oh yeah, like, oh yeah, that's right.
So now that you recognize there's a new way of doing it, you have to remember that there is a new way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that new way of doing it is to gladden the mind,
Yeah.
to make it bright, to take a deep breath, because we need that breath, because when we're not breathing well, that means that we're already gone on to automatic pilot, which means we're down in the rubble again.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the right way to practice. I generally recommend students start doing this several times a day, and I'll go into the details of why that's true. But doing it 4 times a day for 10 or 15 minutes is much better than sitting one time for an hour. Okay, or 2 times for an hour or whatever. That it's better to break it up during the day. Why is that? Because you're not expecting to begin a practice that's eventually going to take you to some temple in Burma where you're sitting 16 hours a day. That's not your goal.
Yeah. That's
Your goal is to live a happy life, which means that we have to practice our life to make it happy. We begin to start seeing what's happening throughout the day. That this really is a practice of getting your whole life straightened out, but we're doing it one moment at a time because we're practicing in the here now, one moment at a time. And as we gain skill in sati, that means that we remember more often. So instead of they say that an average human will breathe 1,400 times in 24 hours.
wow.
So how many of those are going to be actually mindful? How many
Yeah.
of them are going to be intentionally deep breaths?
Mm.
In the beginning, maybe 100 at best. After a very good practice, you're doing up to 1,000.
Wow, that's like insanity. That's
No,
awesome.
well, everybody keeps saying I got to do it all the time. Well, all the time is 14,000 breaths, not 1,000. Okay, so give yourself a break.
Oh
And in fact,
man.
the ones who are saying I've got to do it all the time, they're intentionally putting extra weights on that they don't need. They're making their
Yeah.
practice impossible because they can't do it. That's like saying, okay, I'm going to train to do the 2-minute mile.
Mm.
Can't do it. And all they're going to do is wind up frustrating, probably even kill themselves.
Yeah, that does sound like that.
All right. So this is something to be enjoyed. When do you enjoy it? Every time you remember it,
Mm.
without putting pressure on about how long it's been since you remembered it last time. You're remembering it right now. That's the point. How many right nows can you keep doing? Up to you. So that's how we practice, is in the moment.
Yeah.
And the skills will be developed. If you can get some satisfaction now, then next time you can get a little bit more satisfaction. A few weeks from now, you can get, this is measurable. It used to be at this level of satisfaction, and now it's here. And then you go along, and all of a sudden, the satisfaction is gone. The thrill is gone. Oh, poor me. And we go right into it. Oh, no, now's the time to practice again. Never mind, start again.
Yeah.
So let's bring this one to a close. I think that we've gotten you a point to where you can get started on your practice. So do this for a few days and then call me back, and we'll give you a more formal way of looking at Anapanasati.
Okay.
More of the
That sounds
details of
perfect.
it. But we've already covered the Eightfold Noble Path, so what the heck?
Yeah, it was very the way you explained it was so different than most people explain it. They, especially the part about right view, because right view is usually only seen as, the world is full of good and bad stuff. So know that and you're good. Like, and but I already knew that. I mean, everybody knows that, but it doesn't change anything. And the way you explained it was very more opening. Yeah.
Well, basically, a right view takes one to the state to where we really can see a whole lot about what's going on. In the old days, we used to think we knew everything that was going on and classified everything as good and bad. But now we're going back for a reevaluation, and we're coming to understand that, wait a minute, I can't make good and bad determinations about all of this stuff. It's too complicated. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's real wisdom.
Yeah, and isn't that have to do, not to get too far ahead, but with the dependent origination, I think it's called.
Ah, yes, right. P.S. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
We certainly will. PS means paticca samuppada, which is the Pali word for it, and it means dependent origination. Think of it like this: rather than some highfalutin magical teaching of some whoop-de-doop Buddha or whatever, think of it as actually a map of how the mind works.
Yeah.
Well, we're already starting to look at how the mind works. We're already doing paticca samuppada. We just haven't used that language for it yet.
Yeah. And one more question, if I can. I don't know if you have time or not. Uh, is it okay if I
Go,
ask one more question? Okay.
go ahead.
One thing that has it's a good question now, like what you said, practicing little by little, because before I would just do concentration practice, just, and then there would be parts of my practice that happened like 3 times where I kind of got strung out. Like, does that make sense? Like, kind of strung out, meaning like it was kind of like putting a fuse into the, like, and it started to like it wasn't right. Like my mind was kind of like, oh, a kind of
But
like
you were mulling stuff over.
well, yeah, and also like imagining things and like
Okay.
and like seeing visions of things that weren't like
That
pretty
is
and stuff
very
like
much
that.
what students do,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's much closer to meditation.
Okay.
And in fact, in Christian meditation, they will have meditation upon a particular thing like the Trinity or the divinity of Jesus or other things like this. And the mind just goes buzzing all over the place.
Yeah.
Here, what we're doing is that no, we're actually going to we're going to catch the buzzing. Um, what I also refer to as junk thought, and say, no, we're not going to think about that right now. We're going to
Yeah.
come back, be here in this moment. We're
And
going to think about what's happening right now.
and yeah, and sometimes it would always happen when I was sitting, but sitting for long periods of time, and it was like and just terror, like incredible, like just fear that makes you tremble in a sense. But I don't know why, and I don't know if that's weird or not. But
Well, it was already there, wasn't it?
yeah, and that's what I get to that point sometimes, uh, and it keeps coming back sometimes. I don't know why, but
It's
uh,
instinctual. You already know why. You really
yeah,
do know why.
yeah, yeah. It's like a
Okay,
habit. Yeah.
because of the old habits. And when that happens, it's the emperor.
Mm.
All right, and you're not the emperor. This is the method to where you begin to wake up to that and say, I'm going to be here now. I'm not going to pay any attention to that.
Okay. Yeah.
That we're no longer giving any strength to the rattlings of the mind, and we're going to start paying attention. And by the way, the rattlings of the mind that we're talking about is much more associated with the mammalian brain, the midsection. That basically what the humans have the capability of is looking and seeing directly and putting things together and figuring things out. And
Mm.
so that's what we're doing here is we're going to put the frontal cortex in gear. And that's why we need the extra breathing, is so we can get it into gear and so we can begin to see what's going on.
Okay. Yeah. So 4 times a day, right? Okay. Okay.
All right. So when are you going to call again?
Depends. Probably next week for sure. Because
Okay.
I'm I'm usually free 5 days a week. So um I know you're free most every day. I don't know how frequently because I don't know your schedule and I don't want to like intrude in anything.
Actually, I would say that in the beginning, it's better to call more frequently so that I
Okay.
can keep drilling the stuff into you. And then as
Okay.
our relationship matures, you can back off to once a week. And then I've got students who I don't see for months, and then they call in.
Okay. We can do that too. I just didn't want to like make it like a 1, 2, 3, like bother you or something. Yeah. So
You can't bother me. Only I can do that, and I know how.
so when do
My choice.
when do you wanna like how frequently? When do you wanna call again? If it's up to
Oh,
you.
every 3 days, I would say,
Every
or
three
twice a week,
days.
something like that.
Every 3 days. Okay. So what's today? Okay. Yeah. We
Okay,
would.
Dennis.
Yeah.
Good.
We would have to do it on Monday, because I work weekends. So
Okay.
yeah, at night I work at night and weekends.
Uh, since you're in Florida, and this is the time of year for it's almost over now. But you're 12 hours off, which means that if you called uh, at 9 in the evening, I'm up by then for sure.
Okay. 9 in the evening. Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Um. Yeah. So is Monday good or
Pardon?
is Monday good?
Sure.
Okay, perfect, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay,
I took all of the Mondays and put them through the car wash, and they're
okay,
all good.
okay, perfect,
Every
perfect.
Monday is a good Monday.
All
Up to
right.
you. I
Yes,
mean, you can
yes.
trash it. Many
All
people
right.
spend their whole day trashing Monday. They even
That's
write
good.
songs about it.
All right. Well, I'm gonna
I'm
definitely.
teasing you right now, you
No,
know.
no. I know. I'm just. I'm awkward by nature. Yeah. But okay. So 4 times a day, 15 minutes. Okay. I'll definitely do that and get back to you on it. Hello? Oh,
Okay. Excellent.
all
We'll
right.
see you,
Well,
Dennis.
yes. Have a great day.
Good. You too.